This is when you need to worry about the US dollar crashing. All right. I'm not that worried about it now. Not that worried about it now because we might not be in TINA anymore. There is no alternative. I'm not super worried about the US dollar crashing right now, but I'll tell you when. So we're going to read over here. Here's Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Isn't too worried about the dollar status as a reserve currency, the world's reserve currency, yet. Here's from Nassim. You will only start worrying about the dollar status as a reserve currency when you see long lines outside the British or the Brazilian, Russian, Iranian, and Chinese consulates, full of young professionals seeking immigration visas. So what does that mean? So basically, until you see young professionals going to Russia, the embassies, going to the Chinese embassies, the Brazilian embassies and whatnot, saying, can I emigrate to your country? You don't have to worry about the dollar collapsing. All right, so check this out. We're going to keep going. Again, Vox Day says, oops, start worrying. About 300 German residents are ready to move to the Nizhny Novgorod region. I didn't know what the Nizhny Novgorod region was, so I looked it up, and here it is. It's the second most populous city on the Volga, as well as the Volga Federal District, which is an important economic transportation cultural center in Russia. There you go. It's a main center of river tourism in Russia. It's a historic part of the city where there are many universities, theaters, museums, and churches. Well, it's called Gorky. All right, so there it is. It's in Russia. And it looks like a beautiful city. I don't know anything about it, but it looks freaking fantastic. So there you go. There's Nizhny. All right, let's keep reading. So about 300 German residents are ready to move there. By the end of 2023, this number of applicants can reach 1,000 people, said Olga Guseva, director of the Department of External Relations of the regions. According to her, such activity is due to the fact that Germans see great potential in cooperation with the Nizhny region in the automotive industry, construction, infrastructure development. Most of the people who want to relocate are specialists in the field of metalworking, welders, machine operators, technologists, as well as shipbuilding and automotive industry. So they're saying, I'm going to leave Germany and go here. And the same note is very interesting, by the way. I noticed that Putin has a higher rating among Americans than he has in many, many years, actually. I noticed that. It was interesting, which is somewhat a positive, which shows that whatever the mainstream media is doing isn't reaching the mass that they were able to do in 2001. So that's good. All right, so anyway, we're going to come down here, and we're going to say, I'm going to show you something here real quick. Can someone please explain to me, like I'm 5, the real cause and effect of the U.S. dollar ascending to world domination and now slowly being taken away from that? All right. Currencies have to be backed by something for them to be accepted. For the majority of history, it had been precious metals that backed the currency. The U.S. was on a gold standard, but defaulted in 1933. World War II gives the U.S. a chance to become the global currency of choice due to holding the rest of the world's gold. Here we had the gold, Fort Knox. But then Bretton Woods came along in 1944. All right. However, the U.S. continued to spend more than it earned using credit to cover the difference. And the rest of the world started saying, you're spending too much. We want our gold back. And then came to a head in 1971 where Tricky Dick closed the gold window. No more exchanging our dollars. You can't give us back our dollars for the ounce of gold. To replace this, an agreement with the Saudis was reached to only allow the exchange of OPEC and Saudi oil in U.S. dollars, restoring the foreign demand for U.S. dollars. Are you reading this? It's good education. I didn't even know a lot of this, actually. So basically we had all the gold, Fort Knox. People said, okay, I can trade your dollar for whatever, an ounce of gold, whatever it's 35 bucks, I don't know. But we're spending too much, man, to finance the Medicare in the 60s, to finance wars that we had no money for, should have ever been involved in, turns out, Vietnam, the moon exploration. It was such successful going to the moon that we've never gone back because we lost the technology. I mean, come on, man. There's nothing on the moon that we are interested in. That's what I've heard actually people say. We've found everything we need to know. Okay. But anyway, so we had all this money we're spending like a drunken sailors, but we didn't have enough to cover it in terms of gold at Fort Knox. And so because of that, the Brits were come knocking on the door, say, hey, we want our money back in gold. And Nixon said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do it. We closed the gold window. All right. But instead, we replaced it with a petrodollar, oil. An agreement with Saudis was reached to only allow the exchange of OPEC countries and Saudi oil in U.S. dollars, restoring the demand for U.S. dollars. So if the Brits want to buy oil from the Saudis, which they have to exchange in U.S. dollars. That means they have to have a reserve of U.S. dollars, my friends. They all do, because that's where it gets exchanged in U.S. dollars, and this is where it gets kind of dicey. The consequence was that the U.S. had to prevent oil from being traded in any other currency other than the U.S. dollar to make sure that these countries retain some currency in U.S. dollars. Now, why Saudi Arabia went along with that, I don't know. However, between the constant U.S. printing and debt making dollars less valuable to hold, i.e. we're exporting our inflation, the weaponization of the currency exchange and the holding system, and the weakness of the U.S. is now allowing countries to bypass the U.S. dollar. It's all but the tears, unless the UN wins decisively in Ukraine and elsewhere, and it's not gonna. The weaponization makes the US dollar less valuable because foreign reserves held by countries can now be seized if the US doesn't like your politics, like we've done in Russia. We've held foreign reserves. We said we're going to seize we stole their money. Such reserves are usually held in country of origin, aka yen are held in Japan to facilitate transactions, or the SWIFT banking system. So stealing Russia's US dollars and euro reserves makes the carrot less attractive due to sovereign risk. At the same time, the stick, US military interventions, is also weakening. So you see what's happening here. We're saying basically you have to keep a certain amount of reserves if you want to buy oil in Saudi Arabia and OPEC countries. US dollars. So you have to keep a certain amount. And then when Russia does whatever Russia does, we say we're going to steal those dollars from you because we don't like your politics. So Russia says, okay. So your dollar is weakening. You've been exporting your inflation to all over the world. And the only way I can get oil is through your dollars, okay? And now you stole my dollars because you don't like whatever we do. Okay, so now you've given me every incentive never to hold your dollars again because they can be stolen from me. And so now on top of that, China has the incentive too because we're going to be defending Taiwan, defending Ukraine, defending everything, freaking South Korea. So all these countries said, nah, we don't like this anymore because if we engage in behavior that the U.S. doesn't like, they're going to steal our dollars. So we're going to come up with a secondary system in which to transact oil. Remember, the whole world runs on oil, which is kind of like you think if there's free energy, a la Nikola Tesla, no wonder why the Rockefellers dominated everything over the last 150 years, because that was their money, their cash cow. Get rid of all these other free energy things and make sure everyone goes to oil. And you can say, oh, that's why they're going to solar and wind, but solar and wind won't get the jobs done, dude. It's only replacement is uranium. That's all there is to it. Solar and wind aren't going to get the jobs done. It's freaking nuts. All right, so keep checking this out. The U.S. dollar's outlook is bleak, and I actually agree with this 100%. According to something, the U.S. dollar may lose as much as 15% of its value against major world currencies in the next 18 months. All right, let's check this out. And research released Tuesday, the U.S. reserve system has probably reached or slightly past its peak level hawkishness, and that should mean there would be some rate cuts coming soon. He points out that between the central bank's 9 prior rate hikes and the tightening of credit conditions caused by the U.S. banking crisis, there are indications that inflation is already decreasing, and a loosening of the monetary policy may become necessary to prevent a harder landing. Okay, go. Let's keep going. All right, check this out. The already subdued level of economic activity in major parts of the world will ironically prevent global demand from collapsing. All right. Over the next 18 months, the dollar is vulnerable to substantial depreciation. Keep going. Actually, the article I wanted to look at, but Paul Craig Roberts warns the loss of the petrodollar will be disastrous. So we're going to talk about potential 10 to 15% decline in the U.S. dollar relative to other currencies. That's just come and go. That doesn't bother me. I mean, it is what it is, man. When the dollar loses value, it makes it harder. It makes imports more expensive. So it's when the dollar loses 10 to 15% value, inherently, it's going to make the stuff we're importing 10 to 15% more expensive. That's just a fact, which makes our own manufacturing more valuable, our own domestic manufacturing. That in of itself doesn't bother me. I got no qualm with that. But so here we go. Paul Craig Roberts, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary to the Treasury for Ronald Reagan, warned that if the petrodollar were to cease being the predominant means of setting energy contracts, the value of the US dollar would plummet, which would have massive effects on inflation, interest rates, and economic growth. In the article, Paul Craig Roberts cites Saudi Arabia's recent statement that it would be open to accepting payment for oil in other currencies besides the dollars we already talked about. Since at present, nations looking to purchase oil must retain a reserve of dollars to use for payment. If Saudi Arabia were to allow payment in other currencies, nations would immediately release their reserves of dollars back into the global market. What happens when you increase supply? You want to take a guess. What happens when you increase supply? The surge of additional dollars would immediately cause the value of the dollar to go down. So what's happened? Let's just say Russia, we've stolen their money. Let's say now China has $1 trillion of currency. I have no idea, reserve currency. And China can now trade for for oil in their own currencies, however they come up with it, BRICS currency, whatever it is. All of a sudden, that $1 trillion of U.S. currency that China has in reserve, they don't need it anymore. They'll just flood the market. And then anytime you increase supply that much, the value of the thing drops in value just because there's more of it. No two ways around that. It has nothing to do with printing press, by the way. By forcing nations to pay in dollars, the Saudis generate an additional demand for greenbacks, which elevates the value of the currency. Roberts went on to point out that for 50 years, the petrodollar has allowed the financing of the U.S. massive budget and trade deficits. So the petrodollar supported the continuing role of the U.S. dollar as a world currency after Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. Now Roberts points out that by weaponizing the dollar in geopolitical terms and using it in sanctions and for asset seizures, Washington has generated a motivation among nations to settle contracts in their own currencies in order to escape the D.C. ability to threaten and punish them. 100%. He concluded the article by pointing out if the Saudis do drop the petrodollar, then Americans can expect to see harsh inflation and massive interest rates as the Fed will deliver to try to combat it, which is exactly what happened in 1930 and in Japan in early 1990s. Massive rate hikes to deal with the massive inflation. It's nuts, man. What did that do? We see what happened in Japan, 20 years of deflationary spin cycle. I mean, literally from 1990 to 2011, you lost an average of 7% a year in the Nikkei. 7% a year. 1930s, no one made money. So, in the stocks, that is. Unless the Federal Reserve begins to print money to finance the national deficit, in that case, a hyperinflationary effect will be produced by the monetary inflation being added to the collapse in the forward exchange value of the dollar. All right, so essentially we can monetize our way out of the debt, which is just printing to a blue in the face. That's not gonna happen. So they're just gonna raise the rates. So check this out. While everyone hates inflation, the Fed does. That's their number one priority, to have stable inflation. 2-3% is what they're shooting for. When a huge inflation hits in, they're gonna do a massive deflationary thing, because deflation doesn't bother them so much as inflation. As long as inflation is subdued, they'd much rather have a deflation than a massive inflation. So check this out. So, and during deflation in the 1930s, businesses become paralyzed, unemployment grows, and creditors benefit at the expense of debtors at times of deflation. So, because we don't think there's that much potential for deflation, we're going to incline to fight inflation, which isn't going to be hyperprinting of monetizing the debt so much. I mean, anything could happen, man. We don't know. But what happens during deflation is the creditors benefit at the hands of the debtors. What is the United States? It's a debtor country. So they're going to have to be, it's going to be tough to walk this line, dude, without question, of massive inflation, runaway hyperinflation, and deflation. It's going to be tough. And, well, I don't know how it's going to work out. So again, going back to what Nicholas Nassim Taleb said, is when there's people lining up the consulates of Russia, China, to basically go emigrate there. First of all, that will get rid of the great immigration clown show that we have in the United States. It's inevitable to stop. I mean, no one's emigrating to Greece. No one's emigrating to Italy anymore. No one's emigrating to Egypt because, the great worlds of before. because our economy sucks, dude, relative to other nations out there. So the way to stop immigration is just have an economy that's fluttering around like in the 1970s. No one's immigrating to the United States in the 1970s. Our economy wasn't good. And that brings us to this book, Coming Out of Ice, Victor Herman. What happened? Let's see if I think. I don't know if I, hold on a second. Let's see if I got, if you can get this book, you should. All right, so check this out. And then one day my father came home and said, "Who wants to go?" "Go where?" my brother asked. "Where else?" my father said. "To Russia, to work at Henry Ford's auto plant, to make the machines run and to build a great future for all men." My mom wasn't happy, nor was my brother. My brother was 20 having a good time. What? Leave his girlfriends? No, he was staying put. My sister was now married to a cop. Could a cop go to Russia? So my sister wasn't going either. And was my father really serious? And all I saw was an adventure. Go, my mother said. What do you mean go, Sam? Sam's a dad. For 3 years, my father said. We give 3 years of our lives to build a great socialist world. What does it cost us? 3 measly years. There in Dearborn, on either side of that house that Henry Ford lived in, were woods like a forest, a reindeer walking in. Imagine what I could do in Russia with wolves and bears and all the forests that must grow everything in there. How could I have a boy of 16 know what trees would come to mean to me? However, I guess what a forest could do to you, the malevolence of wood. All right, so let's keep going here. So we're going to look at chapter 8 because it's going to be interesting. You ready? It wasn't really real to me going to someplace foreign until we started packing up. We shipped third class. All right, where we're going, no two ways around it. We hugged my father and kissed him and went back to our packing. And my dad said, as they got on the boat to go to Europe, to ultimately over to Russia, as I got onto the boat, next stop, Nizhny Novgorod, Gorky. We started this whole video on Gorky. Here we come, Nizhny Novgorod. Look out, Nizhny. The Herman boys are coming. They didn't know how to pronounce the name. I don't think my mom had even heard the name before. We went to Nizhny Novgorod, Gorky. Isn't that interesting? So we're going to fast forward here to chapter 8. We were loaded into cattle cars, all the Americans who were headed for Gorky. I did not care about the cattle cars. I was eager to get moving. It did not matter until what. My mother tried to be cheerful, but you could see there was nothing under it but a huge sadness. Our clothing was entirely unsuitable. The warmest things we had were hardly enough for the winter, for what the winter was there. We were cold the whole trip, but we finally made it due east to Gorky, to Nizhny Novgorod. And the rest is what the commies did to this guy. That's when you know the dollar's crashing. When people in the Great Depression, they moved to socialist Russia. Because Stalin called and said, "No, come over here. We need you." And Henry Ford said, "Yeah, we're going to build plants there." It goes along with my line, too, by the way, of, I don't have it here. I'll show you some of my book. This is from my book, Relax and Retire, Debunking Inflation Narrative or Myth. Yeah, Debunking Inflation Fears. In 1931, the BLS surveyed 100 families on behalf of Ford Motor Company in order to secure detailed data regarding the living conditions and expenses of a representative numbers of Ford employees in Detroit, which is where Victor Herman's dad, Sam Herman, worked for Ford in Detroit, Dearborn, who are maintaining a minimum wage of $7 a day. Ford wanted to compare the standard of living in the United States to that of the 17 European cities where Ford had or was considering having automobile plants. And one of those, of course, was Gorky. And one of those families who moved there was Victor Herman and his dad and mom and brother. Because America was falling apart back then. And they said there's better opportunity in commie stuff under Stalin. And they didn't know how bad Stalin was. Potemkin villages, that was even before Stalin, Potemkin villages. That was even before Lenin, actually. That was under the Tsar, Alexander, or whatever. So when you see people line up so when you see immigration just coming to a close and us trying to emigrate, workers, that's when you know the dollar's collapsed. And what does that mean? It's going to be like the 70s all over again, man. The things you buy will be highly, will cost more. No two ways around that. You're going to have to guard what you buy, or you're going to have to hold on to things. You fix things instead of throwing it away. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There will be high inflation for the things you buy, for sure, man. Anytime the dollar collapses, it's going to be higher cost. You'll just buy less. You'll be content with more, or content with less. I mean, it's not the Great Depression. People say, I just can't stress. I had a guy say, it's not going to be a Great Depression. We don't know what's going to be coming on. But the Great Depression in of itself wasn't the worst that's ever happened. It wasn't like Dresden. And I'm not saying it's going to, I don't know. But you can see it a mile away. The things you buy will cost more because they'll be manufactured domestically. There'll be less cheap imports. This is just a fact. It'll be more expensive to pay a guy to put a roof on your home because there'll be less foreign labor to take our jobs. So you buy less, you do with more. You do with less, and you get by in a matter of contentment. But I do know one thing. If we do go through a deflationary time, a la Japan, and from 1990 through basically 2011, you don't want to be in debt. If we go through a Great Depression, we don't want to be in debt. If we go through an inflationary perspective, a la 1970s, being in debt won't be the worst thing, except for the fact that you got to get the income in which to pay the debt. Where does that income come from? You see what I'm saying? So while the inflation eroded the debt in the 1970s, people were having a hard time finding work in which to get the money to pay that debt to begin with. Some people say inflation. I'll take inflation because I'll take debt because inflation will wipe away my debt, dude. That's Love your thoughts. This is a great book. It's not cheap, but if you get it, if I remember, I'll put a link in the show notes. Bye. We'll see you.